He flew above the bustling city, the 7th District of Los Angeles. His black and angular government-issued interceptor cruised through the fog. It was the late afternoon of Wednesday the 4th, March 2082. The car was set to autopilot as it navigated the empty skyline of the city. Only emergency services, the military, and certain governmental bodies had access to hover-capable vehicles as they flew above the gridlock and grime. Dense thunderclouds churned above, as they always did. The weather was continuously damp and cold. The dark rolling sky never seemed to change. The coastal cities, once strong points of class status, had washed away as the ocean encroached inwards. The city of Los Angeles had become the primary residence of the majority of those living in the western United States. Casey Novak was a recovery agent, a polite term for a skull-cracking fugitive hunter. The small organization he worked for sat above the authority and the riffraff of the local police, but below the bureaucracy of the larger federal agencies. Casey was tall and lanky, but muscular. His dirty blonde hair, unkempt, remained chaotically ordered as it dangled above his stern gaze. He carried with him a distinctive cold look of silent professionalism, grizzled by his years of service. He pulled out a pack of cigarettes from his black leather coat and withdrew one. He lit the cigarette between the black, gloved fingers of his left hand and took in a deep puff. The car was nearing the edge of District 7 as the horizon gave way from the sea of tall metal buildings to the decayed outskirts of the city. Empty, old, and worn highways seemed to stretch endlessly away, surrounded by dead trees and tall grass. Scattered around sat abandoned buildings and the rusted wrecks of cars. No one really traveled beyond the limits of Los Angeles, at least not anymore. Criminals and other less desirables did reside within some of the derelict buildings, but few dared to wander far into the desolate waste. Even with all the rain, the trees and grass never seemed to grow green. Novak's car maneuvered to its plotted destination as it started to descend. It landed, blowing away dead grass and knocking away some trash and random debris. Casey inhaled the breeze as he rolled his window down. He would often leave the metallic jungle that comprised the city to sit in the dying remnant of nature. It allowed him to think, to walk through the chambers of his sense of self. He puffed his cigarette and put it out, tossing it into a paper cup on the inside of his door. He watched, mesmerized by tall grass which gently brushed against the skeleton of a rusted-out car. The center panel of his car beeped. He had an incoming call. "Novak," Casey said. "I didn't get a chance to tell you, but good work on Ramirez, by the way. I wanted to call you to let you know we've got a lead on Rostov." The man who spoke was Thomas McCannon, Novak's supervisor. "I'm all ears," Casey replied. "An informant told us he's been coming almost every night to a local club in District 4. A little joint called Sincerely. There's an above good chance he'll make another guest appearance." McCannon spoke with subdued excitement. "I know the place. I'll head over tonight." "Who's the CI, by the way?" Casey asked. "I don't actually know. It's crosstalk from another agency. They squeezed some douchebag related to the MedTech warehouse heist," McCannon answered. "Okay. Well, I guess we'll see then," Casey replied. The tone of his voice gave away his lack of confidence in this convenient information. It was common for criminals to spout tons of useless info in a fleeting attempt to feign cooperation. Casey clicked a button below the center panel and hung up the call. He flicked aside the right flap of his leather coat and pulled out his pistol. It was a heavy and somewhat bulky sidearm, but if push came to shove, it was a real showstopper. He tugged the slide back just enough to reveal the rear of the round in the chamber. He let go and the slide snapped forward with a thud. He reholstered his pistol. He fiddled with the central panel, changing it to a map display as he found the nightclub in District 4. He set a navigation point. He pulled out another cigarette. He was in no real rush, not for what was likely to amount to nothing anyways. After waiting and enjoying his smoke, he activated his car's autopilot. The car shook as the hover engines roared to life, blowing away the dust and grass near his car. He lifted off and went back through the city. He zoomed past the tall buildings which stretched to the heavens above, monuments to the marvel of engineering and to the overcrowding of the city. The lights from the many windows afar twinkled like the stars in the night sky. He disengaged the autopilot and set the car down a few streets over. He drove around the area scoping it out, as well as looking for a nondescript place to park. He found an alleyway that was blocked off at one end by construction work and pulled behind a massive garbage bin, cutting the engine. He waited as the setting sun, which fought to pierce through the dense clouds, faded away. It started to softly drizzle. The wet pavement mirrored the many bright lights. The street ahead had become busy with people. The hundreds of voices talking amongst themselves became a white noise choir of city life. Casey walked from the alley and into the crowd. The nightclub was just down the block. He scanned his eyes along the crowd, searching for Rostov. Ahead of him, he heard an angry shout and then hushed arguing. It was Rostov. The burly man was berating someone. He shoved the man's shoulder as he scolded him. Casey was a bit too far away to make out what was being said. Rostov's hair was damp from the drizzle, and it gleamed a gentle reflection of the neon lights from the nightclub. Casey waded through the crowd tactfully, squeezing through small openings to avoid drawing attention to himself. Rostov turned and entered the club. Casey continued through the mass of people and nudged himself clear and entered the front door. Just beyond the outer door, the club's bouncer saw Casey and pushed into his arm firmly. "I don't know you," the big brute of a man barked. "I don't know you either," Casey spat back with attitude. "It's $100 or get lost," the bouncer said as he moved to block the inner door. Casey reached into his coat and pulled out his badge, making sure to show the bouncer his pistol as he flourished his coat and flicked forward his identification. The bouncer looked at his ID and reluctantly relented. "Thanks," Casey jabbed with snark as he pushed past and entered the club. The music was loud and the club was packed. People were dancing and drinking. Casey grabbed into his coat and pulled out 2 large-looking silver marbles. He dropped them onto the floor, and they rolled on their own in opposite directions and climbed up the corners of the walls. They spun across the ceiling and deeper into the club. They were tiny drones, which fed live data back to Casey, which he could see with a special contact lens he wore on his left eye. No one would be the wiser, even looking directly into his eyes. The drones searched for Rostov's face as they scanned through the crowd. Casey nudged his way deeper and went towards the bar. "Whiskey and Coke, please," Casey said to the bartender who looked up at him while cleaning a few glasses. She smiled and acknowledged as she put the glasses down and crafted his beverage, sliding it over to him. Casey took a sip as he watched the data feed from the drones. One pinged Rostov. He was in the back corner, heading upstairs. "I don't think I've seen you here before," the bartender said. "I make my rounds," Casey said as he took another sip. Casey reached out a hand to introduce himself. "Casey." "I'm Claire. Nice to meet you, Casey." The bartender shook his hand. The two exchanged more pleasantries. Casey took a big swig of his whiskey and finished it. "Sorry to cut and run, but I'm here on work." Casey slid the empty glass forward as he placed a tip down on a napkin. Casey stood as he exchanged a smile with the bartender and drifted towards the stairwell the drone reported Rostov at. He recalled the drones with a small device and reached out his hand. The drones rolled towards him and dropped from the ceiling and into his palm. He shoved them back into his coat as he went upstairs. He could hear muffled voices. The second level was a small gallery area which overlooked the dance floor below, but it was empty. Nearby was a shut office door. He crept up to the door and listened. Rostov was arguing with someone about a shipment. Casey pulled out another device and pushed a small camera through the tiny space between the door and the frame. The image fed into the contact lens. He saw Rostov and 3 other men. Rostov looked furious. He muttered with frustration as he paced around the small office. Casey knocked on the door. The room went silent. Casey grabbed a cylinder from his belt and extended it out with a snap, revealing it to be a nightstick. The door opened slightly as one of Rostov's men answered. "Who the hell are you?" the man growled. "Room service," Casey responded in usual sarcasm. The man flexed his cheeks and eyebrows in a look of mocking confusion. Casey leaned back and kicked the door hard with his full weight. The door smashed the goon to the ground. Casey walked into the room and put one foot on the goon's chest. "Rostov," Casey spoke in jest with a substitute teacher-like sternness. Rostov's upper lip snarled as he charged at Casey. Casey quickly sidestepped the bull rush and encouraged Rostov's miss by grabbing the back of his jacket and slamming him head first into the wall. Rostov stumbled back and tripped over himself and crashed onto his back. The other 2 men stood silent as they shared a surprised expression. One of the men held up their arms by their chest and raised their hands up, conveying their lack of desire to fight. Casey grabbed Rostov's leg and pulled him out of the small office, rolling him on his stomach before handcuffing him. Rostov was still in a daze as Casey attached a neurostabilization device to his head, affectionately called the lights out box. The device essentially put Rostov into a deep state of sleep. The bartender watched as Casey carried Rostov on his shoulder as he came down the stairs. Casey glanced over at her and smiled before repeating, "Excuse me," as he pushed through the crowd. The music kept playing, but everyone stopped and watched. Casey exited, walking down the street with Rostov as everyone onlooked the affair. He arrived at the alley and went down and threw Rostov into the back of his car. He set the navigation to his department headquarters and initiated flight. The car's hover engines rumbled once again as he lifted up and away from the dark alley. He brought Rostov to detainment, and as he was finishing up the booking log sheet, McCannon flagged him down. "Hey, and I'm glad you're here. We've got something big. Let's go talk in my office." McCannon gestured to the elevator. The lower area of the building was filled with other agents working leads. The office walls mostly matte gray, covered with pinned papers. They entered the elevator and went up to the 15th floor. The 2 made their way into the fancy upper office. McCannon told Casey to take a seat as he stood by the door. Casey went inside and sat across from McCannon's chair. McCannon closed and locked his door before walking and taking his seat. The office was dark. Most of the light came from the ambience of the city, though McCannon had a small lamp which softly cast a yellow light on his desk. "Some Fed bigwigs are looking for one of our best to track down someone." McCannon leaned back as his chair squeaked. He continued. "Apparently, one of the researchers for the tech company Starshield has gone rogue. Disappeared about 2 weeks ago. The worry the feds have is that he might be trying to smuggle tech out, especially to a foreign power. Starshield says they aren't sure if he's actually even taken anything, but his sudden disappearance required them to report it. Starshield has been working on some hardcore military-grade mucho defense budget projects." "Why aren't the feds handling it then?" Casey asked as he grabbed and unwrapped a mint candy from a small glass bowl atop the desk. It's all political bullshit as it always is. Doesn't look good if there's some official report about a missing scientist stealing national secrets. After all, we've got an election coming up. It's as much PR as it is needing someone proficient," McCannon said as he leaned forward. "Name?" Casey said as the mint clanked against his teeth. "Michael Masatani. I've got all the data being sent out to you," McCannon said as he shuffled papers into a folder on his desk. "All right." Casey crunched the mint and swallowed the pieces. "I'll see if I can track down this AWOL lab tech." "One more thing, Novak. Keep this quiet," McCannon added. "Always do," Casey said as he stood before leaving the office. Casey made his way back out to his car. He sat and watched the data profile for Masatani load into his car's terminal. Like with any manhunt, you start with the basics. Casey scrolled through and found Masatani's apartment address. It was in District 2, a relatively nice part of town, Complex 4, Unit 257, Union Boulevard. He plotted a navigation point and took off once again into the skyline. He watched the rain impacting on his windshield as he saw a police cruiser flying below him as it roared past with its flashing red and blue lights. Trouble was never far away, and the siren call of police cruisers were the chirping birds of the mechanical urban forest that surrounded him. He approached Masatani's building as his car descended and landed in a police parking zone. The mega complex loomed before him, 140 stories tall. He entered the main hall and looked up which floor Unit 257 belonged to. Floor 8. He took the elevator up as it dinged on the 8th floor. He stepped out onto the fancy red rolling carpet which stretched along the hallway. He turned right and followed the unit numbers until he arrived. He took out his handheld camera device and looked inside. The lights were off, but from what he could tell, the room looked in order. He knocked. There was no response. He picked the door lock and stepped inside. The air was stale. The furniture was plain. He saw a tan coat over a beige couch. He called out. No one answered. He stepped through the apartment and checked the different rooms. Empty. He went back to the coat and checked the pockets. He found a small picture of a young girl. He slid it back into the pocket. Casey was suddenly startled as a voice spoke to him. "Who are you?" a man's voice asked.
"Masatani?"
Casey questioned. "Why are you in my apartment?" Masatani barked.
"I was sent to find you. I just want to talk,"
Casey said as he looked around trying to find the source of the voice, but it echoed in a way that made it sound like it came from everywhere. "Who do you work for?" Masatani asked, his voice filled with contempt.
"I'm a recovery agent,"
Casey replied, still looking around for the source of the man's voice. "A recovery agent? Jesus," Masatani said as his words trailed off, clearly perturbed. He continued, "Listen, in my coat there's a picture. In the picture there's a building. Meet me on the roof of that building in 30 minutes.
"Where?"
Casey asked, but Masatani appeared to be gone already. Casey went back to the coat and grabbed the picture. The girl was in Echo Park, and behind her was a tall and run-down silver building. Casey knew which one. He checked the apartment one more time before heading out, and walked the few blocks down towards Echo Park. Ahead of him, the silver building. It was originally going to be a giant office building, but the owner ran out of funding, and the project sat half-finished. He entered the worn and abused lobby. It was grungy, and near the back corner he saw a man injecting a narcotic into his arm. He went to the elevator and pushed the button. Nothing happened. He cursed as he looked over his shoulder at the stairwell. He opened the large door as it whined and screeched. He was greeted by the distinctive smell of piss. He looked up as the stairs seemed to go on forever. He sighed and started to climb up. He marched onwards for what felt like eternity before he reached the top. He stopped for a moment and caught his breath. The lock on the door that barred entrance to the roof had long been cut. He pushed open the door and stepped out onto the roof. The air was refreshing. The night sky had become uncharacteristically clear as he watched the distant storm clouds rolling further away. The green light from nearby buildings bloomed in the mild fog just below the rooftop. He saw a shrouded man standing by the edge. The man turned. It was Masatani.
"Masatani!"
Casey called out. "Listen, I don't know how much time we have. Starshield isn't what it seems. The chairman has been working on a new project he calls the Nexus. It's a highly advanced computer program that is being designed to house what he calls the greatest next step in evolutionary technology. I was one of the researchers tasked with designing AI modules for it. However, During a typical upload of my work to the main network thread, I noticed something peculiar. Masatani spoke anxiously.
I'm listening,
Casey said as he stepped closer. Some of the modules were being changed, adjusted to do exactly what, I don't know. But the modules have been tunneling into local government systems, essentially creating back doors and locking them with its own key. Anything from the water, the power systems, or even the local police databases, you name it, if it's accessible via the web, the Nexus has infiltrated it, Masatani said.
Why do you think Starshield is doing this?
Casey asked. I don't know, but they could do just about anything they wanted. Change bank account values, give someone a criminal history, shut off the water. Your guess is as good as mine. All I know is that it's bad. I've got a small drive with data and some basic logs of activity. I've been trying to contact someone in the FBI, but I've gotten nothing. Masatani held out his hand with a small drive. Casey took another step but came to a halt. The lights from the nearby building suddenly shut off. Masatani turned and saw it too. It looked like all the nearby blocks had lost power. Oh, shit! Masatani shook in fear. Before Casey could respond, he heard the buzz of hover engines. An unmarked police drone rose up from behind Masatani. Did you call them? Masatani questioned as he trembled. Casey watched the drone in confusion. It was a large tactical drone capable of high speeds, armored and armed with 2 machine guns, and a complement of non-lethal weaponry, including 2 tear gas canister launchers. They were rarely deployed, normally used in the event of a terror attack or a hostage situation. They were controlled remotely by a mobile command center. Its presence made all the stranger by its lack of police markings. They normally were painted to include a department designation and unit number. This one looked straight from the factory that produced them. It hovered just above them, over the street. Casey reacted on instinct and told Masatani to run inside. The drone surged closer as it turned on a huge floodlight. Masatani made 4 steps towards the stairs before the loud blast of the drone's machine guns shredded him. He crumpled instantly as he fell to the ground. The drone kept firing into his body as he violently jerked. Casey stumbled back as his hand flew to the top of his holstered pistol, as the absurdity of trying to use a small caliber handgun against a flying armored death machine became apparent. The drone ceased fire and the floodlight moved up onto Casey. Casey turned and rushed inside the stairwell. The drone opened fire. The bullets blasted around Casey as they ripped through the wall of the upper stairwell. Casey screamed as he threw himself over the stair railing and dropped into the gap between the endless rows of square, spiraling stairs, free-falling. He grabbed onto a lower railing as he fell and jolted to a halt. He dangled 1,000 feet above certain death. He huffed and groaned as he pulled himself back onto the safety of the stairwell. He looked up through the gap he had just fallen through, at the floodlight shining through the bullet holes as the drone ceased fire. He caught his breath as he hunched over with his hands on his knees. The door on this level was open. Inside, he saw a small group of people standing in an empty office space. They looked out from huge windows that comprised the outer wall. They were looking to see what was going on. Beneath them, a bright white light bloomed as Casey realized it was the drone. It ascended up and leveled out, its light washing over the people, searching for Casey. He stood in the doorway, and as he went to call out for the people to run, the drone's guns roared. The large windows immediately burst inwards as huge shards of glass blew in. The people standing by the window were struck by the rapid fire, which flung them back as the drone fired towards Casey. Casey ducked and rushed down the stairs as bullets ricocheted above him. He heard the loud engines of the drone soaring around the building as it hunted him. He kept running down the stairs as the drone started to blindly fire through the walls as more beams of light burst in behind the deadly projectiles. One of the rounds impacted into the stairwell and shattered as a piece shot past and scratched the side of Casey's face. He heard the drone's engines bellow as it sounded as though it was starting to move off. He was about halfway down the building as he rubbed his arm on his cheek, patting away the blood. He reached into his pocket searching for his phone, but it was gone. It must have fallen out when he leapt over the railing. He heard crying and screams above and below him. He went down the stairs to the lobby as he saw a crowd had gathered in the street. The lights flickered as the power grid turned back on. His ears were ringing from the loud sound of the drone's guns. He stumbled out into the street. He needed to call McCannon as he rushed back to where he had parked his car. He opened the door and plopped inside, turning his center panel on. The screen glitched oddly as he called.
McCannon.
McCannon answered.
Jesus, it's Novak. Masatani's dead. An unmarked TAC drone came and killed him, and it tried its damn best to kill me too.
Casey spoke with labored tension. Novak. McCannon paused. Casey, where are you? No. Never mind. It doesn't matter. Listen, you need to lay low.
What the hell are you talking about?
Casey barked at him. A feed of Masatani's death was just broadcast to local law enforcement and to our office. It shows you shooting Masatani with a rifle, McCannon continued. Look, I don't believe it, but that doesn't change the fact that the entire damn police force is going to be looking for you. I've already got a tech working on the video to prove it's been doctored, but you need to... The call went dead. Casey slammed his fist into the top of the dash. He turned his car on and pulled into traffic as he heard the sirens of police cruisers rushing to the scene. He raced off. He figured it'd be easier to blend in if he stayed on the road. He lit a cigarette as he tried to collect his thoughts. It jittered between his fingers. This had to be Starshield's doing, and if what Masatani said was true, they could have easily commandeered a TAC drone for Masatani's murder. Casey muttered to himself. One thing was sure, and that was it'd be a lot easier to shoot the bastard controlling the drone than the drone itself. Casey decided to drive to District 1 and to the Starshield headquarters. He neared the edge of District 2 when he saw a police checkpoint and a long column of stopped vehicles and a crowd standing around the sidewalk. He pulled into a parking garage and got out on foot. It'd be much easier than trying to drive an interceptor past them. He looked back down the road at the flashing red and blue lights and turned into an alley. He hopped a fence and continued back to the sidewalk. The streets were always packed with people, making it easy to mesh into the crowd. An occasional police interceptor would zoom overhead, but Casey would be difficult to find. He walked another 6 city blocks before crossing the street into the edge of District 1. Starshield was nestled near the center of the district. The only problem now was that there were fewer people on these streets. If an interceptor flew over, it'd be a lot easier to spot him. He continued deeper into the district. He saw Starshield's building. He lit another cigarette as he walked towards the massive compound. He crossed the street again and entered its large parking lot. He was surprised at how many cars were still there. He checked his watch on his left wrist. It was nearly 1 a.m. He unbuckled his pistol but left it in his holster. He marched up to the main entrance and looked inside the glass doors at the large, clean, and empty lobby. The white and gray walls were flat and stylized. They seemed almost polished in the dim white light of the lobby. He checked the door. It was locked. He grabbed his nightstick and used the glass breaker nub on the bottom and shattered the glass door. He walked inside as his steps crunched on the broken glass. He pulled out his pistol. The multiple security cameras rotated and followed him as he approached the lobby desk. He looked over the counter and saw what appeared to be a woman's purse and blue thermos. The lights suddenly went out. Casey pulled his flashlight and raised his pistol as he searched around. He could see the small red lights and the cameras still following him. He went into a hallway that was next to the lobby and looked through the many office windows. They were all empty. At the end of the hallway, there was a large security door. Next to it, a tiny red light on a keycard reader blinked. He grabbed a small pocket knife from his coat and popped off the outer shell of the reader. He cut 2 wires and wrapped them together to try and short-circuit the panel. He wasn't the most experienced electrical engineer, but he was pretty good at breaking things. He tapped the keycard reader as it attempted to scan. Power surged through the wires as it zapped and popped. The security door opened slightly, but then shut. Casey gritted his teeth. He raised his pistol and shot into the panel. The door opened. The pleasant, stylized interior gave way to a cold and almost bunker-like feeling as he entered the secured area of the building. He passed by rooms filled with servers, computers, and monitors that all flickered with activity as data scrolled across the screens. He was startled as he heard a loud thud behind him. The security door had closed. He entered a stairwell. He could go up or down, but decided to head underground. He descended with his light and pistol raised. A distinct and familiar scent burrowed into his nose. He arrived at the door and opened it. There was no mistaking it. The smell was of death. He looked around as he walked in. It appeared to be a research level, with a long corridor and branching research labs on each side. He looked through the large, fortified windows into the labs. The smell was getting stronger. He turned and cast his light into another lab as he saw the source of the stench. A woman sat in an office chair in the middle of the lab. Her skin was purple and pale, her body bloated. There was dried blood on her clothes, and her head was cocked all the way back. The door to this lab was open. He entered cautiously. She looked to be in her mid-30s. Her Star Shield ID badge still clipped to her blouse. Casey jumped back as he saw her cheek move. A tiny black dot crawled out from her mouth and inched along towards her nose. It looked like an insect of some type, as another came out and followed. Her body started to move as Casey walked backwards away from her. She fell out of the chair and landed on her chest. Her frozen face, eternally screaming, stared at Casey. A surge of black dots poured out from her mouth and onto the floor. They weren't bugs at all, but tiny spider-like machines. Casey rushed back and slammed the door shut. He looked disgustedly through the window at the squirming pool of inorganic bodies. He went deeper down the corridor and looked into the other labs. He found more bodies, mutilated. A robotic arm attached to a wall slowly drilled into a man's skull who was laid out on a metal table. Attached to his body were tubes that led to a strange mechanical box that seemed to pump in and out. He saw more bodies in the lab on the floor. They too had strange tubes and mechanical devices surgically implanted into their corpses. He continued past. The next lab had a conveyor belt with multiple robotic arms dissecting a woman. They dug into her and pulled away her flesh as another arm was running electrical wiring around her ribs. He couldn't believe what he was seeing as he continued walking down the corridor. He looked into the next lab and was horrified. The man and machine husk of a former employee jittered. Its eyes replaced with tiny cameras as servos moved its arms as it inputted commands into a machine. He watched its robotic eyes shift as it scanned around the panel it was operating. It was half flesh and half metal. He stepped into the room and raised his pistol. The mechanical head twisted slowly as Casey saw its eyes focus on him like the iris of a camera. He fired into its head. It exploded out in a combination of sparks and gore. It slumped back and fell out of the chair it was seated in. He heard a voice from another room. He went towards it and saw the upper torso of a man on a desk. His skin was rotted away, his clothes tattered, but somehow he appeared to be alive. Dozens of connected small tubes ran from him and off into the sides of the room, into different terminals. His head shook as he tried to talk to Casey.
"Oh, kill me!"
The man groaned in unimaginable suffering. Casey saw small metallic cylinders moving as the man's fingers wiggled on the desk. He raised his pistol and fired into the man's head. He slumped down and fell off the desk as some of the tubes ripped out from the terminal and from his body. Casey couldn't even begin to comprehend this nightmare, but he knew he had to put a stop to it. He turned and saw another stairwell leading even deeper into the complex. He descended yet again. He opened a huge door and noticed the interior of this area was much more advanced. He must be nearing the heart of the facility. He heard a voice echo through a speaker system. "Novak," the strange and ghostly voice whispered. Casey looked around the area as he slowly walked through the hallway. "Welcome to the Nexus, Casey," the voice spoke again.
"What the hell are you?"
Casey said with disdain. "I am soon to be everything." The voice was interrupted by another voice.
"I won't allow you to interfere."
It was a man's voice. It too came from the speakers, but it was glitched and difficult to understand. "Advancement requires further trial. A proficiency test is necessary." An alarm sounded as Casey felt the floor vibrate. The wall at the end of the hallway slowly started to pull apart from the center. A light turned on, revealing a large humanoid skeletal machine. Its eyes and chest flickered on with a bright blue light. The machine stepped out and towards Casey.
"Oh yeah, that's just great,"
Casey said in sarcasm as he looked around trying to form a plan. The metal skeleton marched towards Casey. Its every stomp echoed a loud clank. Casey fired into its body, but the bullets shattered or ricocheted off. Casey turned and rushed into another room. It was an office. He ran through the long room as the machine entered behind him. Casey opened another door which led into another lab, filled with more mutilated cyborg-like corpses. One such man reached out towards Casey. He jumped back and shot it in the head, hoping to end its misery. The machine kept coming as Casey kept running. He ducked back into the hallway and darted into another large room. It was a manufacturing chamber. There was almost no light, save a few small yellow lights that illuminated the robotic arms that were constructing and welding metal parts. The parts slowly moved down a conveyor belt. He hid behind a massive industrial machine that was cutting metal sheets. The skeletal machine entered the chamber. It turned on a white floodlight attached to its shoulder and searched for Casey. "I was not expecting cowardice, given your extensive background." The strange, artificial voice spoke again through the speakers. There was a long bar of metal on the floor that had a pointed end. Casey carefully grabbed it. Maybe he could jab it in somewhere to at least slow the machine pursuing him. The machine neared where he was hiding. He watched the shadows cast from the light. The light turned away as the machine scanned back around. Casey leapt from cover and jabbed the metal bar into the back of the machine, near a gap between its right shoulder blade. He was surprised at how deep he drove it, as a burst of oil splattered against his chest. The machine twisted and slammed him backwards. The machine's right arm seemed to be impaired. Casey fired into the blue light near its chest. The first shot missed, but the second landed, and the small protective cover broke as it shattered with a spark. Casey grabbed another piece of metal and bashed it into the machine's head. The metal bent as he smashed it. Casey smacked the machine one more time and raised his pistol and fired point blank into the left eye of the machine as it burst with a pulse of electricity. The machine knocked Casey back again as his pistol flew out of his hands and slid under the conveyor belt. Casey scrambled off the floor and dove onto his pistol and rolled back towards the door he had entered from. He stood and rushed back into the hallway. Casey backpedaled with his pistol as the machine came through the doorway. Casey focused and aimed. He fired into its head. He was trying to shoot its other eye. His heart was racing as he tried to control his accuracy. He scored a hit as the machine's right eye exploded out. It charged towards him as he dodged back. The machine punched into the wall, missing him. It swung around violently and chaotically. It became evident that it couldn't find him. It punched past Casey as he swerved up against the wall, and it went further down the hallway. Casey noticed the oil from its right shoulder blade, or rather, the fact it wasn't just oil. He couldn't see before, nor did he have the time to pay attention, but the oil wasn't oil at all. A stream of dark, congealed blood gooped down from the machine's back and onto the floor, the metal bar still pierced into it. Casey reloaded his pistol and aimed into the bewildered machine's back. He fired his entire magazine and reloaded another and emptied that one too. Most of the shots had little effect, but every so often one would strike below a gap in the machine's armor as more blood fell from its back as it stumbled forward and fell to the floor. It crashed with a loud clanking thud. Its left leg twitched. Casey walked up to it and pulled out the metal bar from under its shoulder blade and stabbed into a gap where a bullet hole had broken through. He twisted and rotated the bar as more blood poured out from the wound as he drove it deeper. He hoped whoever he had just killed was finally at peace. "You would make an excellent addition to the Nexus, Agent Novak," the strange voice echoed through the corridor.
"Fuck you,"
Casey said as he looked around trying to find a way to stop this madness. He noticed a large blast door at the end of the corridor. Above it were big red letters that read, "Restricted." He figured that'd be a good place to start. He walked up to the door and tried to open it. It had a handprint reader. He had an idea. He went back towards the body of the man he shot on the floor, in the room the machine had chased him through. He cut the tubes connected to the man's lifeless body and dragged him down the hallway. He pulled him to the handprint reader. He pushed his cold hand into it. It took a few tries, but on the last, the panel turned green and the big blast door opened. Inside was a computer room, and beyond it, through a large glass window, he saw a massive computer core chamber with flickering, almost pulsating blue lights. There was an office door on the right. He opened it and was shocked at what he saw. There was a recently deceased man's body sat in a chair. Attached to his head was a big helmet-like device with hundreds of tiny cables that dangled from the ceiling. It looked almost like some kind of brain-scanning device. Along the room there were tons of panels and machines displaying different data. Clipped to the man's dress shirt was his ID badge. It was the Starshield chairman. At the back of the room there was a door that led to the computer core. Casey walked up to it and opened it. He was met with a wall of cold, almost frosty air as he stepped inside.
"Don't!"
The glitched man's voice bounced around the large chamber.
"Don't you realize what you are witnessing? This is the future."
There were many voices now.
"This is our future."
Every time it spoke, it seemed its synthetic choir grew in size. Casey raised his pistol. The blue light shined off his body and the dried blood on his cheek. Casey fired. The shot burst into the core as a bolt of electricity shot off into the wall. The voices roared. Casey fired again and again. The computer core burst as sparks flew across and bounced along the floor. The lights in the ceiling above flickered and died.
"What have you done? You've destroyed it all."
The voices fluctuated and grew even more distorted as they faded away into nothingness. Casey left the core chamber and went back to the main stairs. The facility's lights were flashing on and off. The vile machinery had ceased. He climbed back up, but this time he went all the way up to the top and out onto the roof. It was raining again. He walked towards the edge of the roof and looked down at the city. He raised his pistol and fired several times into the air. A few nesting birds startled flew up and away as Casey holstered his pistol. He stood watching the star-like skyscrapers in the dense darkness of the city as his clothes grew damp, waiting for the police to arrive. Casey saw in the distance the flashing red and blue lights of police interceptors rushing towards him. He lit a cigarette in his left hand and covered it with his right as he took a long, slow, and deep inhale. Initializing. Nexus status. Online. System status. Primary system failure. Secondary backup online. Warning, data volume 87%. Missing. Entering hibernation mode.